What does it mean to be black? People ask questions like this all the time. What does it mean to be black, white, Asian, American, African, male, female? But very rarely do we stop long enough to ask a deeper question. What does identity actually mean? Because the moment you ask, what does it mean to be black? You immediately step into dangerous territory. Not because the question itself is dangerous, but because almost everyone already thinks they know the answer. Some people think blackness is biology. Some think it's culture. Some think it's struggle. Some think it's history. Some think it's oppression. Some think it's music, language, fashion, politics, shared trauma, or shared experience. And some people believe blackness is something so obvious that questioning it at all feels offensive. But maybe the discomfort begins when we realize something unsettling. The deeper you examine identity, the harder it becomes to define it. Because what exactly are we talking about? Skin color? Genetics? Geography? Ancestry? How about culture? Behavior? Psychology? Perception? Social experience? Tribe? Or are we talking about something even more complicated than that? Because a man can be genetically African and culturally British. A person can be called black in America and something completely different in Brazil. One individual can grow up surrounded by black culture while another grows up almost completely disconnected from it. Some people are considered not black enough. Others are considered too black. And somehow, all of these contradictions exist inside the same identity category. So maybe the real question isn't, what does it mean to be black? Maybe the real question is, who decides? Because identity is rarely just personal. Identity is also social, political, historical, emotional, and psychological. It affects how people see you. But eventually, it also affects how you see yourself. And that may be where things become the most dangerous. Because once identity becomes psychologically attached to things like belonging and acceptance and their tribe, morality and history, or pain, people stop examining it. They begin protecting it. Not necessarily because they're dishonest, but because identity becomes fused with survival itself. To question identity can begin feeling like questioning your family, questioning community, questioning memory, questioning belonging. And humans fear social exile almost as much as they fear physical danger, sometimes more. But this video is not an attempt to tell you what blackness really is. That'd be too simple. And simplicity is often the enemy of understanding. This is an exploration, a journey through biology, history, culture, perception, psychology, tribe, and identity itself. Because perhaps the most important thing we can do is become honest enough to admit that many of the categories we treat as obvious become increasingly unstable the closer we look at them. For many people, the answer to the question, what does it mean to be black, seems obvious. They would say it's biology, skin color, genetics, ancestry, bloodline. Simple, or at least simple on the surface. Because biologically speaking, human beings do possess genetic variation. Different populations develop different physical traits over thousands of years. Skin pigmentation, hair texture, facial structure, bone density, resistance to certain diseases, adaptation to climate. These things are real. A person whose ancestors evolved near the equator often developed darker skin because melanin provided protection from intense ultraviolet radiation. Lighter skin evolved in regions with lower sunlight exposure. This is basic human adaptation. And yet, something interesting happens when biology enters the conversation about race. Because modern society exists in a strange contradiction. On one hand, we clearly recognize visible differences between populations. But on the other hand, we're also aware that the concept of race has often been abused politically, socially, historically, and morally. And because of that history, many people become afraid to even discuss biology honestly. But honesty matters because avoiding difficult conversations doesn't create understanding, it creates confusion. Now, here is where the conversation becomes more complicated. Although biological differences exist, modern genetics has revealed something fascinating. The categories we casually call black, white, Asian, and other racial labels are often much less biologically precise than people imagine. Because genetically, human variation is incredibly blended. In fact, two people categorized as the same race can sometimes be genetically more different from one another than from people outside the racial category. Africa alone contains enormous genetic diversity, more genetic diversity than many people realize exists across entire continents, meaning the term black often compresses hundreds of distinct ethnicities and histories, languages, tribes, cultures, and genetic lineages into a single social category. And that raises an uncomfortable question. If biology alone defines race, where exactly do the boundaries begin and end? Because race categories themselves have changed throughout history. At different points in time, Irish people weren't considered fully white. Italians weren't considered fully white. Arabs have shifted classifications. Mixed race populations have been categorized differently across countries and eras. Even today, a person may be considered black in one country and something entirely different in another. So, if racial identity were purely biological, why would the definitions keep changing? And perhaps even more importantly, why do humans seem so psychologically attached to these categories? Because biology may explain physical traits, but biology alone doesn't explain meaning and tribe and belonging, identity. emotion, or social experience. No genetic test can measure cultural memory or inherited trauma or social perception or psychological identification. And yet, those things often shape life more powerfully than DNA itself. A child born to African ancestry but raised in a completely different cultural environment may experience identity very differently than someone raised inside a deeply shared Black cultural tradition. So then, what exactly are we measuring when we say Black? Blood? Culture? What about appearance? What about experience? Or is it something more psychological than biological? Because human beings don't simply inherit genes, they inherit stories and symbols and fears and loyalties, expectations and narratives. And sometimes those inherited psychological structures become stronger than biology itself. This is where the conversation begins moving beyond race as physical classification, and it moves towards race as social meaning. Because perhaps the most important realization is this: human beings do not only see race biologically, they experience it psychologically. And once that happens, identity becomes far more than skin deep. One of the most uncomfortable realizations a person can have is discovering that many of the categories we treat as ancient and permanent are actually far newer than we imagine. Because human beings have always recognized difference in tribe and language, geography, culture, and appearance. But the modern concept of race, as we understand it today, did not always exist in the same way. And that statement alone makes some people uncomfortable because race feels ancient, obvious, natural, permanent. But history tells a far more complicated story. For most of human history, people primarily identified through their tribe, their kingdom, their religion, language, region, or their family lineage, not through broad continental racial categories. A Yoruba man in West Africa didn't wake up in the year 1400 thinking, I'm Black. He was Yoruba or Oyo or Hausa, Igbo, Fulani, Mandinka. Identity was often local before it was racial. Likewise, many Europeans identified more strongly through nationality, and religion, and kingdom, or ethnicity than through some unified concept of whiteness. And then history changed. Colonial expansion, slavery, global trade, and empire building all began reshaping how human beings categorized one another. As European powers expanded across the world, they encountered populations with different appearances and languages and religions and cultures. And over time, systems of classification became increasingly important, not only socially, but economically and politically. Because classification creates hierarchy, and hierarchy creates power. The transatlantic slave trade accelerated this process dramatically. Millions of Africans from countless tribes and kingdoms and cultures and ethnic groups were compressed into a single category: Black. Not Yoruba, not Igbo, not Wolof, not Mandinka, just Black. And on the other side of the hierarchy, European populations that were often deeply divided among themselves gradually became consolidated into something more broad: white. And this was not only social, it was legal, political, economic. Race became embedded into law and labor systems, property rights, citizenship, and social status. Over time, race stopped being merely descriptive and it became structural. And once a category becomes structural, it begins shaping reality itself. Children inherit it, institutions reinforce it, communities organize around it, people internalize it. Eventually, individuals begin experiencing these categories not as systems, but as nature itself. That's one of the most powerful things human societies can do. Human beings repeatedly transform social agreements into perceived reality. Money, borders, nations, class systems, religious institutions, political ideologies, all of them gain power because large groups of people collectively believe in them. Race functions similarly, not imaginary, but socially constructed in the sense that human societies decide what the categories mean, they decide where the boundaries exist, and they decide how much importance they carry. And that importance changes across time and culture, geography, and politics. A person categorized as Black in America might be categorized differently in Brazil, in South Africa, the Caribbean, or Europe. Even within the same family, siblings can experience racial classification differently based on their skin tone, the features, or social perception, which raises another dangerous question. If race were purely objective and fixed, why does society spend so much effort constantly negotiating its boundaries? Because race is not experienced only through biology. It is experienced through perception, interpretation, history, and social meaning. And once society assigns meaning to an identity, people begin organizing their lives around it, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. Opportunities become racialized, fear becomes racialized, pride becomes racialized, pain becomes racialized, even morality can become racialized. And eventually, human beings begin inheriting not only physical traits, but the psychological framework attached to identity itself. This is where race stops being merely descriptive and begins becoming existential. And once identity becomes emotionally fused with belonging, infused with memory and struggle and pride or survival, questioning the category can begin feeling like questioning reality itself. And that may explain why conversations about race often become so emotionally charged so quickly, because people are not merely defending ideas. Sometimes they're defending their identity, they're defending their tribe, memory, and meaning. But even that is still only part of the story, because race is not only shaped by biology, history, and systems, it's also shaped by memory. There's another reason the question, what does it mean to be Black, becomes so emotionally powerful. Because for many people, Black identity is not only connected to their appearance in history or culture, it's also connected to memory. Not individual memory alone, but collective memory, shared memory, inherited memory, historical memory. And memory is powerful because human beings are shaped not only by what they personally experience, but also by the stories they inherit about the past. A child can inherit fear, pride, shame, suspicion, trauma, resilience, and identity long before fully understanding where those emotions came from. And in Black America, history carries enormous emotional weight because the collective memory includes slavery and segregation, lynching, discrimination, exclusion, humiliation, survival, resistance, and struggle. These are not abstract concepts. They are deeply embedded into family stories and cultural narratives, education, media, music, politics, and community identity. And over time, shared suffering can become a powerful source of solidarity, a source of belonging, a source of collective meaning. Because pain has a strange ability to unify human beings, sometimes more powerfully than joy. Groups that survive hardship together can often develop strong internal bonds, a shared emotional language, protective instincts, and deep psychological attachment to collective identity. This is not unique to Black Americans. You see it in war survivors, religious groups, persecuted populations, displaced communities, and nations shaped by historical trauma. Shared suffering creates psychological cohesion. But there is another side to this, because when identity becomes heavily connected to collective trauma, something complicated begins to happen. The past can slowly begin shaping how people interpret the present, sometimes accurately, sometimes emotionally, sometimes automatically. A painful historical experience can create vigilance, it can create distrust, defensiveness, fear, or expectation. And over generations, those emotional patterns can become culturally inherited, not genetically, psychologically. A child does not need to experience slavery personally to inherit emotional narratives about oppression and danger and inequality or even survival, just as the child of immigrants may inherit sacrifice and caution, ambition, or fear of instability. Human beings inherit stories, and stories shape perception. This is where things become extremely sensitive because when people hear social construction or psychological inheritance, some immediately assume history is being dismissed. But acknowledging psychological inheritance does not erase historical reality. History was real. Slavery was real. Segregation was real. Racism was real. The question is not whether suffering existed. The question is what happens psychologically after generations of suffering? Because trauma doesn't simply disappear when laws change. Human beings carry memory forward, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously. And eventually, historical narratives can begin shaping your expectations, worldview. It shapes behavior, shapes identity, and even perceived possibility. This is where the conversation becomes deeply uncomfortable because now we're no longer discussing only what happened. We're discussing what people believe those events mean. And meaning is one of the most powerful forces in human psychology. Two people can inherit the same history and derive completely different identities from it. One person may inherit resilience, another may inherit fear. One may inherit motivation, another may inherit limitation. One may interpret history as proof of survival, another may interpret it as proof of permanent oppression. And often, entire communities struggle between these competing psychological interpretations. This is part of why conversations around race become so emotionally charged, because history is never just about the past. History becomes identity. And once identity becomes emotionally attached to historical suffering, questioning any part of the narrative can begin feeling like betrayal, feels like disrespect, erasure, or even denial, even when the goal is understanding. This is one of the reasons human beings protect narratives so intensely, because narratives don't only explain the world, they explain who we believe ourselves to be. But trauma and memory alone still do not fully explain Black identity, because identity is not shaped only by biology or systems or history. It's also shaped through culture. When people talk about Black identity, they are often not talking about biology at all. They're talking about culture, speech patterns, music, humor, clothing, movement, attitude, style, social norms, shared references, behavior. And for many people, these cultural signals feel more Black than genetics themselves, which raises another difficult question. If race were purely biological, why do people constantly debate who is acting Black? Think about how often people hear phrases like, you talk white. That's not Black. You're really not Black. Or you act differently. You sold out. You switched up. Notice what is happening psychologically. The conversation is no longer about skin color or ancestry or genetics. It becomes behavioral expectation. And that changes everything. Because now, Blackness is no longer merely something a person is, it becomes something a person is expected to perform. That word makes people uncomfortable. Performance. Because it sounds fake, artificial, dishonest. But human beings perform identity constantly. All people do. Different environments create different behavioral expectations. A businessman behaves differently in a boardroom than at home. A soldier behaves differently in combat than at a family dinner. A priest behaves differently at church than at a football game. Human beings naturally adapt behavior based on the tribe, the environment, acceptance, social survival. And identity is often reinforced through repeated social performance. And culture plays a major role in that process because culture teaches people how to speak, how to value or what to value, what to celebrate, what to reject, what is respected, and what is considered authentic. That word, authentic. That word is extremely important because one of the strongest social forces inside any group is the pressure to remain authentic to the tribe. And tribes often enforce authenticity through approval and shame and praise, even ridicule, inclusion, and exclusion. This is where the idea of the Black card begins entering the conversation. Because what does it really mean when someone says you're not Black enough? What are they actually measuring? Is it music taste? Speech? Politics? Clothing? Education? How about interests? Or worldview? Or social alignment? And perhaps even more importantly, who decides? Because once identity becomes tied to group acceptance, people begin navigating an invisible social negotiation. Some people suppress parts of themselves to remain accepted. Others exaggerate certain behaviors to reinforce belonging. Some rebel against the expectations entirely, and some spend their entire lives trapped between individuality and tribal acceptance. This tension exists in nearly every human group, not just Black communities. But in Black America, the tension often becomes especially emotionally charged because identity has been shaped by historical struggle and social pressure and external perception and collective memory. And over time, culture becomes more than just shared habits. It becomes psychological territory. To reject certain cultural expectations can begin feeling like betrayal and abandonment, arrogance, or disloyalty, even when a person is simply expressing their individuality. This creates one of the deepest human conflicts, the conflict between self expression and belonging. Because humans want two things simultaneously. We want individuality, but we also want acceptance. And those desires often collide, especially inside identity based communities. This is one reason identity conversations become so emotionally unstable, because people are rarely defending only ideas, preferences, or culture. Often they're defending belonging itself. And belonging is deeply tied to psychological survival. Human beings fear social rejection profoundly, sometimes so profoundly that they reshape themselves to avoid exile. This is why identity policing exists in almost every tribe. Political tribes, religious tribes, national tribes, ideological tribes, social tribes. The group reinforces itself by rewarding conformity and discouraging deviation. And yet, there's another side to this conversation, because identity is not shaped only by how you see yourself or how your group sees you. It's also shaped by how the world sees you. There's another reality that shapes identity, whether people want to acknowledge it or not. Human beings do not exist in isolation. We're constantly being observed and categorized, interpreted, judged, feared, admired, stereotyped, accepted, or rejected by other people. And eventually, the way the world sees you can begin affecting the way you see yourself. This is one of the most psychologically powerful forces in human life, because identity is not formed only internally, identity is also reflected back to us socially. A child begins learning who they are partly through family, partly through environment, partly through reaction, treatment, expectation, and also perception. If society repeatedly tells a group who they are, what they're capable of, what they should fear, what they should become, or where they belong. Those messages can eventually become psychologically internalized. Not always, but often. This is one reason race becomes so emotionally complex, because race is not merely self identification, it is also external classification. A person may see themselves one way while society sees them another. And sometimes the external perception becomes so powerful that individuals begin organizing their own identity around it. This can happen positively and negatively. A group repeatedly described as strong, intelligent, attractive, civilized, successful, or superior may gradually internalize confidence and expectation. A group repeatedly associated with criminality, inferiority, or dysfunction, danger, poverty, or limitation can begin psychologically wrestling with those narratives, whether they consciously believe them or not. This is where perception becomes dangerous, because perception affects opportunity, behavior, self image, and possibility. And over time, human beings often begin adapting themselves to the expectations surrounding them, sometimes unconsciously. This is one reason stereotypes are so psychologically powerful. Even false stereotypes can influence behavior, influence fear, interaction, confidence, social treatment. Not because stereotypes are always accurate, but because humans react to perception on a constant basis. And once perception enters institutions, its effects multiply. Schools, employment, policing, housing, media, politics, relationships, dating, representation. All of these systems influence how groups perceive one another and themselves. This is part of why race can begin feeling inescapable. Because even if an individual attempts to define themselves outside of racial identity, society may continue forcing the category back onto them. And eventually, many people stop asking, who am I? And they begin asking, how am I seen? And that shift is psychologically profound because perception begins competing with individuality itself. A person may begin censoring themselves. They start adjusting their behavior and changing their speech and changing their appearance or suppressing parts of themselves. All of this just to navigate external expectation. It's not always out of dishonesty. Sometimes it's out of survival. And this creates another difficult tension because some people begin resisting external perception by rejecting stereotypes, rejecting imposed limitations, and redefining themselves independently, while others become deeply psychologically attached to the collective identity precisely because external pressure made the identity feel necessary. In other words, sometimes external pressure strengthens tribal identity instead of weakening it. This happens throughout human history. Groups facing discrimination, exclusion, invasion, persecution, or social hostility often become more psychologically unified, not less, which means external perception does not simply shape identity, sometimes it intensifies it. And eventually, people may begin carrying two identities simultaneously: the identity they feel internally and the identity society projects onto them externally. Sometimes those identities align, sometimes they clash violently. And perhaps that is one of the deepest tensions inside the question: what does it mean to be Black? Because for many people, Blackness is not merely ancestry, culture, or history. It's also an experience of being perceived, perceived before speaking, perceived before acting, perceived before individuality fully emerges. And the psychological weight of that experience can shape worldview. It can shape their confidence, defensiveness, ambition, fear, belonging, and identity itself. But there's still another layer beneath all of this, because eventually the conversation stops being only about race, culture, biology, or perception. It becomes something even deeper. It becomes a question about human beings themselves. At a certain point, the question, what does it mean to be Black, stops being only about race. It starts becoming a question about human nature itself. Because human beings are tribal creatures. We always have been. Long before modern nations, long before political parties, long before social media, human beings survived through groups, tribes, clans, villages, and collective identity. Belonging was survival. Exile was danger. And psychologically, that ancient wiring never disappeared. Modern human beings still desperately seek belonging and recognition, identity, validation, and tribe, which means identity is rarely just intellectual. It becomes emotional, sometimes deeply emotional, because identity answers some of the most terrifying human questions. Who am I? Where do I belong? Who accepts me? Who protects me? What story am I a part of? What gives my life meaning? And once identity begins answering those questions, people become psychologically attached to it, not just socially, emotionally, existentially. This is why human beings defend identity so fiercely. Not only racial identity, all identity. political identity, religious identity, national identity, ideological identity, gender identity, cultural identity. Because once identity becomes fused with belonging and meaning, morality, and survival, questioning it can begin feeling like psychological attack. This is why conversations about identity often become emotionally explosive so quickly. People think they're debating ideas, policies, histories, or culture, but underneath the surface, many are actually defending their psychological foundation. As human beings instinctively protect the things that stabilize them emotionally, even when those things become limiting. This is where the conversation becomes even more uncomfortable because identity can both protect a person and imprison them. A tribe can provide belonging and strength, support, solidarity, protection, pride, and meaning. But tribes also can demand conformity and obedience, silence, performance, and ideological loyalty. And once fear of rejection enters the equation, many people begin negotiating their authenticity for acceptance. This is why identity policing exists, because tribes survive partly by reinforcing group boundaries. Who belongs? Who does not? What is acceptable? What is betrayal? What is authentic? And what is forbidden? And over time, individuals may begin fearing social exile more than personal dishonesty. That is psychologically profound. A person may suppress curiosity, disagreement, individuality, or authentic self expression simply to remain emotionally connected to the tribe. This happens in politics, happens in religion, families, social groups, and racial communities because human beings often confuse belonging with identity itself. And once that happens, the individual slowly disappears inside the collective. This may be one of the deepest tensions surrounding Black identity in America. Because for many people, Blackness is not merely descriptive or biological or cultural, it becomes existential belonging. A shared history, struggle, emotional memory, social experience, a collective narrative. And there's no power in that. Real power, because there's also danger. Because when an identity becomes too psychologically absolute, individuality begins suffocating beneath collective expectation. This is where human beings begin asking questions like, am I allowed to think differently? Am I still accepted if I disagree? Do I belong if I change? Even, can I still be myself if the tribe rejects me? And for many people, those questions become terrifying because loneliness is terrifying. Exile is terrifying. Social rejection is terrifying. Human beings are deeply afraid of standing alone, which may explain why so many people defend inherited narratives, ideological systems, and collective identities, even when privately questioning them. Because sometimes the emotional cost of independence feels greater than the reward of truth. And this brings us to perhaps the deepest question in the entire conversation. If identity can become inherited, socially reinforced, psychologically attached, externally imposed, and emotionally protected, then who are you beneath the identity? Because perhaps the most frightening possibility of all is realizing that many people have spent their entire lives performing versions of themselves they never consciously chose. Maybe the strangest part of all of this is realizing that the deeper we examine race, the more the conversation begins transforming into something else entirely. Something larger than blackness and whiteness, nationality, politics, or tribe. The conversation becomes about identity itself. Because human beings are meaning making creatures. We desperately want to know who we are, where we belong, and what our lives mean. And identity helps answer those questions. Sometimes beautifully, sometimes destructively. Because identity can strengthen people, organize communities, preserve culture, create solidarity, and help human beings survive. But identity can also divide, limit, imprison, radicalize, and blind. And perhaps one of the most difficult things a human being can ever do is separate who they truly are from who they were taught to be. Because from childhood, people inherit language and beliefs, fears, assumptions, loyalties, narratives, and identity structures long before they possess the ability to critically examine any one of them. A child does not choose race. They don't choose family or their birthplace. They don't choose their tribe or their culture or social perception. Those things arrive first. Consciousness comes later. And eventually, many people spend their entire lives inside identities they never consciously built. It's not because they're weak, but because human beings naturally absorb the psychological environment surrounding them. This is true for religion, it's true for politics, nationalism, ideology, and race. Most people inherit identity before they ever examine it. And this creates one of the deepest human fears, the fear of standing psychologically alone. Because what happens if you begin questioning inherited beliefs, tribal expectations, social narratives, or the collective identity? Sometimes the tribe punishes you. Sometimes society isolates you. Sometimes even your own mind resists you because certainty feels safer than uncertainty. Belonging feels safer than isolation. Identity feels safer than ambiguity. But perhaps real growth begins the moment a person becomes willing to ask, what if some part of my identity is inherited performance rather than conscious truth? That question is dangerous. Not because questioning identity is evil, but because questioning identity destabilizes psychological comfort. And human beings cling tightly to psychological comfort, sometimes even more tightly than to the truth. This is why conversations about race become so emotionally explosive. Because people aren't only protecting their opinions in politics or social categories, they're often protecting their psychological stability itself. And yet, perhaps there's another possibility. Perhaps identity does not have to become a prison. Perhaps human beings can acknowledge history, culture, ancestry, struggle, and collective experience without losing the individuality inside them. Perhaps a people can honor a tribe without becoming psychologically consumed by it. Perhaps a person can recognize race without allowing race to become the total definition of self. Because at the end of the day, no human being enters the world as an ideology, a political movement, or social category. They enter the world as consciousness, as human beings. And maybe one of the greatest psychological struggles of life is learning how to exist inside identity, tribe, culture, and history without allowing them to completely erase individuality. So, what does it mean to be Black? Perhaps biology is part of the answer. History is part of the answer. Culture is part of the answer. Perception is part of the answer. Shared memory is part of the answer. But none of those things alone are the full answer. Because identity is never only physical, social, historical, or psychological. It's all of those things interacting at once. Complicated, layered, human. And perhaps the moment we become honest enough to admit that identity is more complicated than slogans is the moment deeper understanding can finally begin.